What does a life built on 15 years of love and sacrifice look like when it's shattered in 15 seconds? For Eleanor Vance, it looked like a perfectly packed suitcase and the glint of car keys in her husband's hand. He told her he was leaving her for a woman half her age, a woman who offered him a future she no longer could. Eleanor was left with nothing but a quiet, empty house and the ghost of a future that had been stolen. But in the depths of her despair, a letter would arrive, an inheritance from a man she barely remembered that would change everything. This isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about what happens when the woman everyone underestimated inherits $1 billion empire and is forced to become the queen she never knew she was. The silence in their suburban Connecticut home had become a living entity. It breathed in the spaces between clipped sentences and echoed in the hallways where laughter used to reside. Eleanor Vance, at 42, had become an expert in interpreting this silence. Tonight it was heavy, suffocating, carrying the bitter scent of an ending she'd refused to see coming. For 15 years, she had been the bedrock of Mark Stanton's life. She'd been the one who worked 2 jobs to put him through his MBA program, the one who proofread his reports until 3 a.m., and the one who networked tirelessly at bland corporate dinners, charming his superiors while he took the credit. She had willingly shrunk her own world, postponing her dreams of opening a small art gallery so that his could expand. His success, she'd told herself, was their success. Now, as a senior vice president at a rapidly growing tech firm, Sterling Finch Associates, he had the world at his feet. And he was about to use those feet to walk right out of her life. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to her, swirling a glass of Macallan 18. The expensive whiskey had been her anniversary gift to him 2 months prior. He hadn't even opened it until tonight. "I need to tell you something, Ellie," he said, his voice unusually flat, stripped of the easy charm that had once captivated her. Eleanor's hands stilled over the half-folded laundry on the sofa. "You've been quiet all week, Mark. Is everything okay at work?" It was her default setting to soothe, to manage, to fix his world. He turned, and the look on his face was one she'd never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but a cold, hard resolve. He looked like a stranger wearing her husband's face. "It's not about work. It's about us." The 3 words landed like stones in the quiet room. "Us," she whispered, her heart beginning a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. "There is no us anymore," he stated, taking a deliberate sip of his whiskey. "I'm leaving." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs in a sharp, painful rush. She sank onto the couch, the crisp scent of laundry detergent suddenly nauseating. Leaving. For a business trip. "You didn't tell me?" "No, Eleanor," he interrupted, his patience already worn thin. "I'm leaving you." He gestured toward the hallway where a sleek leather suitcase stood waiting by the door, a suitcase she hadn't noticed. "My things are packed." Her mind raced desperately, searching for a reason, a fight she'd forgotten, a slight she'd made. There was nothing. They hadn't truly connected in months, maybe years, but this was an amputation without warning. Why? The word was a pathetic squeak. "What did I do?" Mark let out a sigh, a sound of profound irritation, as if her question were an inconvenient piece of administrative work he had to get through. "You didn't do anything. That's the problem. We're stuck, Ellie. This house, this routine. It's a comfortable prison. I'm 45. I want more. I want to feel alive. And I make you feel dead," she asked, the words coated in a disbelief that was quickly curdling into horror. He finally had the decency to look away, focusing on the dying embers in the fireplace. "I've met someone. Of course." The cliché was so brutal, so common, it felt like a parody. But the pain was blindingly real. It radiated from her chest, a searing heat that made it hard to breathe. "Who?" "Her name is?" "Chloe Decker," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with an ease that suggested he'd practiced it, savored it. "She's different. She's vibrant. She sees the world as an adventure." Eleanor didn't need to ask. She knew. She's young. She's 26. He admitted a flicker of defiance in his eyes. And she believes in me. She sees the man I'm trying to become, not the man I've been. The insult was a dagger twisted with precision. Every sacrifice she'd ever made, every late night, every canceled plan with friends, every dollar she'd invested in him, it was all being reframed as a cage he was now bravely escaping. She had built this man piece by piece, and now he was walking away with a newer, shinier model. 15 years, Mark. She choked out tears, finally blurring his cold, handsome face. We built a life together. You don't just throw that away for a 26-year-old's sense of adventure. It's not just that, he said, his voice hardening again. Chloe's father is a partner at a venture capital firm. She understands my world. She can help me. With her connections, I can finally break free from Sterling Finch and start my own company. It's the opportunity of a lifetime. The confession was more devastating than the affair itself. It wasn't just about passion. It was a business transaction. He had weighed his options, calculated the return on investment, and she had been deemed a depreciating asset. He was liquidating their marriage for a chance at a more profitable merger. He walked over to the antique writing desk in the corner, a piece she had lovingly restored by hand. He placed a thick manila envelope on the polished wood. These are the divorce papers. My lawyer drew them up. I think you'll find the terms are adequate. The house is mortgaged to the hilt for my seed capital, so it'll have to be sold. But you'll get half of what's left. It's fair. Fair. The word was a mockery. He was taking their shared past, their future, and a young new partner, and leaving her with half the proceeds of a forced sale and a set of legal documents. Eleanor stood up, her legs trembling. She walked toward him, a storm of fury and grief raging inside her. For a moment she thought she might scream, might claw at his face, might shatter the expensive bottle of whiskey over his head. But when she spoke, her voice was eerily calm. "Get out," she said. Mark looked surprised, as if he had expected more tears, more pleading. "Ellie, let's be adults about this." I said, "Get out of my house," she repeated, her voice low and dangerous. The woman who had spent 15 years accommodating him was gone. In her place was someone he didn't recognize. Take your suitcase and your ambition and your collateral and get out. He stared at her for a long moment, then shrugged a final dismissive gesture. He picked up his keys from the mantelpiece. "Fine. My lawyer will be in touch with yours." He walked out the door without a backward glance. The click of the lock echoed in the crushing silence. Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that was no longer hers. The laundry was still unfolded. The dinner she'd planned was still in the refrigerator. The future she had believed in was gone. She slowly sank to her knees, the sound of her own broken sobs, the only thing filling the vast empty space where a marriage used to be. The 6 months that followed were a blur of gray. Eleanor moved through life like a ghost, haunting the ruins of her own existence. The beautiful house was sold, its contents divided with the sterile precision of a legal document. Mark, true to his word, had been fair. After paying off the second mortgage he'd taken out for his new venture, her share was barely enough to secure a small one-bedroom apartment in a less fashionable part of town and cover her expenses for a few months. Her days were formless. She'd wake up late, the sunlight filtering through the cheap blinds of her new apartment, feeling like an accusation. She applied for jobs, curator positions, gallery assistant roles, but her resume had a 15-year gap labeled homemaker. In a competitive market, she was an antique. Rejection emails piled up, each one a small, sharp confirmation of her own obsolescence. Mark, meanwhile, was thriving. She'd see him accidentally on purpose articles in the local business journal about his new startup, Stanton Innovations, with a smiling photo of him and a radiant Chloe Decker by his side. They were the city's new power couple. He was living the life he'd claimed she'd held him back from, and the world was applauding him for it. Eleanor was at her absolute nadir one Tuesday afternoon, staring at an eviction notice she'd found taped to her door when the letter arrived. It was innocuous, tucked between a credit card offer and a utility bill. The envelope was thick, cream-colored cardstock with the name of a prestigious-sounding law firm embossed in the corner, Davies & Finch, LLP. She assumed it was a mistake, or worse, another bill collector who'd bought her debt. She tossed it onto her small kitchen counter where it lay unopened for 3 days. The phone calls started on the 4th day. A polite, firm voice identified himself as James Davies, a senior partner at the firm. He insisted it was a matter of utmost urgency that he speak with Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Fearing a lawsuit she couldn't possibly afford, Eleanor finally answered. "This is she," she said, her voice weak. "Mrs. Vance. Thank you for taking my call." The man said, his tone one of respectful gravity. "I have been trying to reach you regarding the estate of my late client, Mr. Arthur Pendleton. It is imperative that you come to our offices at your earliest convenience." The name struck a distant, dusty chord in her memory. Arthur Pendleton, her mother's uncle, her great-uncle, a man she had met only once at a family funeral when she was 7 years old. She remembered a tall, severe-looking man with piercing blue eyes who had given her a strange, intricate puzzle box instead of a doll. Her mother had spoken of him in hushed, intimidated tones, the family eccentric, a recluse who had built some sort of vast business empire from nothing and had long since severed ties with the rest of the family. My great-uncle, Eleanor asked, confused. "I haven't seen or spoken to him in over 30 years. I'm afraid there must be some mistake." "There is no mistake, Mrs. Vance," Mr. Davies replied patiently. "Could you be at our offices tomorrow at 10 a.m.? Driven by a morbid curiosity and a sense that she had nothing left to lose, Eleanor agreed. The next morning she put on her one good suit, now a little loose on her frame, and took the bus downtown. The offices of Davies & Finch occupied the top floor of a gleaming skyscraper, a world of polished marble, hushed tones, and panoramic city views. It was a world she and Mark had once aspired to. Now she felt like an intruder. James Davies was an older gentleman, perhaps in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a reassuringly calm demeanor that stood in stark contrast to the opulence of his surroundings. He led her into a large wood-paneled conference room overlooking the city. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Vance," he began, gesturing for her to sit. "I was Arthur Pendleton's attorney and his friend for over 40 years. He was a singular man. He did not believe in empty gestures or pleasantries. He valued substance above all else." Eleanor nodded, unsure of what to say. "I barely knew him. I can't imagine why he would have mentioned me to you." Mr. Davies slid a thick leather-bound document across the vast mahogany table. "He did more than mention you, Mrs. Vance. This is his last will and testament. It is a very straightforward document. He had no wife and no children. With the exception of a few small bequests to his staff, he has left his entire estate to you." Eleanor stared at him blankly. His estate, eh? A house, some savings. She was thinking perhaps of enough money to pay her rent for a year. That alone felt like winning the lottery. A small, wry smile touched Mr. Davies' lips. Arthur was not a man of small things. His house is a 40-acre estate in Greenwich. His savings are a portfolio of investments managed by some of the sharpest minds on Wall Street. But the bulk of his estate, the very heart of it, is his company. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. He has left you his sole controlling interest in Pendleton Industries. Eleanor's mind went blank. Pendleton Industries. She'd heard the name, of course. It was a behemoth, a global conglomerate with interests in technology, manufacturing, real estate, and logistics. It was a name spoken with reverence in the financial world. It was an empire. "That's impossible," she stammered, shaking her head. "There has to be a mistake. He didn't know me. Why would he leave it all to me?" "Arthur had his reasons," Mr. Davies said softly. "He followed your life from a distance more than you know. He believed, well, his reasons are his own, and he left them for you to discover. He gestured to a smaller sealed envelope on the table. He left a letter, the first of several to be given to you today. Eleanor reached out a trembling hand and took the envelope. Her name was written on the front in a strong, spiky, old-fashioned script. She looked from the letter to the will, to the kind-faced lawyer who was telling her something so ludicrous, so life-altering, that it felt like a dream. What is it all worth? She whispered the question, feeling both vulgar and necessary. Mr. Davies looked at her, his expression unreadable. The valuations are still being finalized, but the conservative estimate, Mrs. Vance, is in the range of $9 billion. The room began to spin. $9 billion. The number was so abstract it was meaningless. It was a galaxy away from the eviction notice taped to her apartment door. Just yesterday, her biggest problem was how she would afford groceries for the next week. Now she was the heir to an empire built by a man she didn't know for reasons she couldn't fathom. The shock was so profound it felt like a physical blow. The quiet, broken woman who had walked into this office was gone. In her place sat someone else, someone with a new, terrifying, and unimaginable identity. She wasn't just Eleanor Vance, the abandoned wife. She was Eleanor Vance, the billionaire heiress. And her world, which had ended so brutally 6 months ago, was about to begin again in the most spectacular way possible. News of Eleanor's inheritance didn't just spread, it detonated. Within 48 hours, the mystery heiress of Pendleton Industries was the lead story on every financial news network. Journalists dug into her past, painting a portrait of a quiet suburban housewife thrust into an unimaginable position of power. Her quiet, painful divorce was suddenly public fodder. Eleanor hid in her small apartment, the blinds drawn as the world outside roared. Mr. Davies had arranged for a private security detail, and a calm, broad-shouldered man named Robert now sat in a car outside her building, turning away a relentless stream of reporters. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from distant relatives she hadn't heard from in decades, all offering their syrupy, opportunistic congratulations. But there was only one call she was waiting for. It came on the third day. The caller ID simply read, Mark. She let it ring 4 times before answering, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Hello, Mark," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Ellie, my God, is it true?" He sounded breathless, a frantic edge to his usually smooth tone. "The news? They're saying you inherited Arthur Pendleton's entire fortune. It's a joke, right? Some kind of insane media hoax." "It's not a hoax, Mark," she replied, a strange sense of detachment settling over her. A choked, strangled sound came from his end of the line. It might have been a laugh or a sob. $9 billion. They're saying $9 billion. Ellie, that's impossible. You met the man once. Nevertheless, it's true. The silence that followed was thick with the sound of a man's entire worldview shattering. She could picture him perfectly pacing his sleek, minimalist office at Stanton Innovations, his mind reeling, his ego screaming in protest. He had discarded her. He had calculated her worth and found it to be negligible. And he had been wrong on a scale so cosmic it was almost comical. "Well, my God, congratulations!" He finally managed to say the words, sounding like they were being dragged from him under duress. This is incredible. For you." "Yes, it is," she said, refusing to give him an inch of emotional satisfaction. Meanwhile, across town in a chic, glass-walled apartment, Chloe Decker was having a very different reaction. "What do you mean it's true?" she shrieked, throwing a copy of the Wall Street Journal at Mark. Eleanor's face, a candid photo taken years ago at a charity event, stared up from the front page. "That frumpy, boring woman is a billionaire, while we're struggling to make payroll. We are not struggling to make payroll." Mark snapped, his face pale with stress. Stanton Innovations wasn't the overnight success he had promised. His seed money was burning faster than he'd anticipated, and the investors Chloe's father had introduced him to were proving skeptical. "She has to give you some of it," Chloe insisted, her pretty face twisted with avarice. "You were married for 15 years. You built a life together. You're entitled to half of that. It's marital property." "It's not marital property, Chloe, I checked," Mark growled, running a hand through his hair. "The inheritance came after the divorce was finalized. I'm not entitled to a single damn penny." The injustice of it was a physical sickness in his gut. He had traded in his wife for a better prospect only to discover he'd traded a lottery ticket for a handful of magic beans. "Then you have to get back with her," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Talk to her. Apologize. Tell her you made a terrible mistake. She was always a sentimental fool for you, Mark. You can win her back." The thought was both humiliating and tantalizing. The idea of crawling back to Eleanor admitting his colossal error in judgment was galling. But the thought of her $9 billion... It was a siren song he couldn't ignore. Back in her apartment, Eleanor hung up on Mark's stammering and finally opened the letter from her great-uncle. The paper was thick, the ink a faded black. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has likely been turned upside down for you. I imagine you are asking yourself a simple question. Why you? I will not burden you with a long sentimental explanation. I was not a sentimental man, but I was an observer of character. I met you only once when you were a child. You were crying because your cousins had broken a toy. But you were not crying about the toy. You were crying because, as you told me, they broke the rules. Even then you had a rigid, unshakable sense of fairness and order. A rare quality. I have followed your life from afar. I watched you sacrifice your own ambitions for your husband's. A foolish, sentimental act, I thought at the time, but it was also an act of profound loyalty and investment. You are a builder, Eleanor. You invested everything you had into building that man up. He, it turns out, was a poor investment, a shoddy foundation. I am leaving you my life's work, Pendleton Industries. It is not a gift. It is a burden. It is a vast, complex machine, and many of its parts are operated by men who will see you as an intruder, a foolish woman who won the lottery. They will test you. They will try to wrest control from you. They will expect you to take the money and disappear. Do not. You have spent 15 years building a man. Now I am giving you the chance to build an empire. The choice is yours. Take the money, live a life of leisure, and the jackals on my board will carve up my legacy within a year. Or step into my shoes, learn the machine, run it, show them what a builder can truly do. Your first test awaits you at the first board meeting. They will propose a candidate for CEO, a man named Charles Sterling. He is competent, but he is a caretaker, not a visionary. He will manage the company's decline gracefully. Your first decision is what to do about him. Do not let them intimidate you, child. You have iron in your spine. You've just let it go unused for too long. Yours, Arthur Pendleton. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. A strange sense of calm washed over her. The letter was a posthumous vote of confidence from a man who barely knew her, yet seemed to see her more clearly than anyone ever had. You are a builder. The words resonated deep within her. He was right. She had built a life, a home, a man. And when that was all torn down, she had crumbled. But Arthur wasn't asking her to be the person she had been. He was challenging her to become someone new. He wasn't just giving her his money. He was giving her a purpose, a new foundation to build upon. She picked up the phone and called Mr. Davies. Please schedule the board meeting for next Monday, she said, her voice clear and firm. And cancel the security detail. I'll be moving into my great-uncle's estate tomorrow. It's time I started acting like I belong there. The Pendleton estate in Greenwich was not a house. It was a kingdom. A long winding driveway cut through acres of ancient woods before opening onto a sprawling stone mansion that overlooked the Long Island Sound. It was intimidatingly grand, a monument to a life lived on a scale Eleanor could barely comprehend. Her first week was a whirlwind of introductions to household staff meetings with wealth managers and fittings with stylists who replaced her modest wardrobe with racks of tailored suits, silk blouses, and elegant dresses. It felt like putting on a costume, but with each passing day the role of Eleanor Vance heiress began to feel less like an act. The true test, however, was the first board meeting. It was held in a cavernous room at the Pendleton Industries headquarters in Manhattan. A dozen men, all older, all dressed in immaculate bespoke suits, were seated around a vast polished obsidian table. The air was thick with skepticism and cologne. At the head of the table sat Charles Sterling, the man Arthur's letter had warned her about. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and an air of patrician authority. He was the chairman of the board, and it was clear he considered himself the de facto ruler of this empire. "Ms. Vance," he began, his tone dripping with condescending courtesy. "On behalf of the board, allow me to express our deepest condolences on the passing of your great uncle. Arthur was a Titan. His shoes will be impossible to fill." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Especially for you. We understand this must be an overwhelming time for you." Sterling continued. "Therefore, to ensure the stability of the company, the board has moved to unanimously nominate a new CEO. I have graciously agreed to step into the role to guide Pendleton Industries through this transition." He smiled, a placid, dismissive smile that said the matter was already settled. The other board members murmured their assent. They were looking at her, but they weren't seeing her. They were seeing a problem to be managed, a figurehead to be placated with dividends while they ran the show. Eleanor felt a tremor of her old self, the timid, accommodating woman who would have nodded, signed the papers, and gratefully accepted her comfortable exile. But then she thought of Arthur's letter. "You have iron in your spine." She took a slow, deliberate breath. "Thank you for your condolences, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the silent room. "And thank you for your gracious offer. However, I cannot accept it at this time." A ripple of surprise went through the room. Charles Sterling's smile tightened. "I beg your pardon, Ms. Vance. With all due respect, this company is a multi-billion-dollar global entity. It requires an experienced hand at the helm." "I agree," Eleanor said smoothly. "Which is why I find it puzzling that the board would nominate a CEO before the new owner has even had a chance to review the company's current state. It seems premature." She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member one by one. "I will not be a passive owner, gentlemen. For the next 90 days, the position of CEO will remain vacant. I will be taking that time to personally conduct a full review of every division of this company. I will be meeting with every department head. I will be reading every financial report. And at the end of those 90 days, I will decide who is best suited to lead my company into the future." She let her gaze settle back on Sterling. "That may be you, Mr. Sterling. It may not be. Until then, you and this board will report directly to me." The silence that followed was absolute electric. She had thrown a grenade onto their perfectly polished table. Sterling's face was a mask of fury, his patrician composure shattered. He had expected a mouse. He had found a lioness. "You are making a grave mistake," he said, his voice a low growl. "The only mistake, Mr. Sterling," Eleanor replied, rising from her chair, "would be to underestimate me. My great-uncle did not make that mistake. I suggest you don't either." She turned and walked out of the room. Her back straight, her head held high, leaving a stunned and furious board of directors in her wake. She didn't know if she had just won their respect or declared a war she couldn't win. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt a thrilling, terrifying surge of power. She wasn't just wearing the costume anymore. She was starting to become the person Arthur Pendleton had believed her to be. The news of her boardroom coup reached Mark within the hour. A contact on the Pendleton board, a man he had once golfed with, called him in a panic. "Your ex-wife is a dragon, Stanton," the man sputtered. "She just walked in here and castrated Sterling in front of the entire board. She's taking over. She's insane." Mark hung up the phone, a cold dread mixing with a bitter, burning envy. The sentimental fool he thought he could win back was gone. In her place was a formidable, ruthless stranger. A queen. And he, Mark Stanton, the brilliant entrepreneur, was beginning to realize a terrifying truth. His biggest asset wasn't the venture capital his new girlfriend's father could provide. His biggest asset was the woman he had thrown away, and now she was about to become his most powerful and unpredictable rival. The 90 days of Eleanor's review were a baptism by fire. She worked 18-hour days fueled by coffee and a ferocious determination to prove her great-uncle right. She devoured financial reports, strategic plans, and personnel files. She walked the floors of Pendleton manufacturing plants, donned a hard hat at their construction sites, and sat in on the pitch meetings of their tech incubators. She wasn't just learning the business. She was absorbing it, making Arthur's empire her own piece, by painstaking piece. The board under Charles Sterling's resentful leadership tried to obstruct her at every turn. They buried her in jargon-filled reports, scheduled meetings on impossibly short notice, and subtly encouraged department heads to be uncooperative. But they underestimated her resolve. The same meticulous attention to detail she had once applied to managing Mark's career, she now applied to dissecting a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. And she was a very fast learner. It was during her review of the Pendleton Capital Division, the company's venture capital arm, that she saw it. A funding proposal from a plucky startup called Stanton Innovations, Mark's company. Her blood ran cold. He was coming to her company for money. The irony was so thick she could have choked on it. He had left her in part for better financial connections, and now he was unknowingly kneeling at her altar begging for an investment. The proposal was desperate. Stanton Innovations was burning through its initial seed money at an alarming rate. They had a promising prototype for a new logistics software, but they were months behind schedule and hemorrhaging cash. Without a significant Series A funding round, they would be insolvent within 6 months. Her first instinct was a savage, satisfying desire for revenge. She could crush him. A single word from her no, and his dream, the very dream for which he had destroyed their marriage, would die. She could leak the news of his impending failure to the press. She could ruin him utterly. The thought was a dark, intoxicating poison. That night she found the second letter Arthur had left for her tucked away in his library, with a note for Mr. Davies to give it to her after her first month. Eleanor. By now you have likely encountered the jackals. You have felt their teeth. I trust you have shown them your own. But a leader must be more than a fighter. A fighter can win a battle, but it takes a builder to win a war. Pendleton Industries did not become what it is by destroying its rivals. It grew by absorbing them, by identifying value where others saw none, and by turning weakness into strength. You will soon be faced with a choice to destroy something or to build from its ruins. Remember what you are. Be a builder, not a wrecker. Yours. Arthur. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time, the fire crackling in the massive stone hearth. Be a builder, not a wrecker. Arthur's words cut through her rage, offering a different path. Revenge was easy. It was an emotional spasm. Building was hard. It required vision, strategy, and a cold, clear head. The next morning she called the head of Pendleton Capital. I want to be in the final pitch meeting for the Stanton Innovations proposal, she said. But I am to be introduced only as a senior analyst from the new owner's office. No one is to know my name. Is that understood? The day of the pitch arrived. Eleanor sat at the far end of a long conference table, deliberately out of the main line of sight. She was dressed in a simple, severe gray suit, her hair pulled back, a pair of glasses perched on her nose. She was invisible. Mark Stanton walked in, flanked by Chloe Decker. He was a portrait of manufactured confidence, his suit sharp, his smile practiced. Chloe, dressed in a vibrant red dress that was wholly inappropriate for a venture capital pitch, looked around the room with an air of entitled boredom. Mark launched into his presentation. He was slick, charismatic, and passionate. He spoke of disruption, synergy, and market penetration. But Eleanor, armed with weeks of intensive study, could see the holes. His financial projections were wildly optimistic. His market analysis was superficial. His understanding of the supply chain challenges was amateurish. He was selling a dream, not a business. When he finished, the head of Pendleton Capital, a shrewd man named Marcus Thorne, began the grilling. "Mr. Stanton, your burn rate is unsustainable. How do you plan to achieve profitability when your customer acquisition cost is 3 times the industry average?" Mark faltered, offering a vague answer about economies of scale. Another executive pressed him on his technical architecture. He deflected. It was painfully clear he was out of his depth. Finally, Marcus Thorne turned to the end of the table. "Our senior analyst has a final question." All eyes turned to Eleanor. She took off her glasses, letting the silence stretch for a moment. Mark's eyes followed the others. He squinted, a flicker of confusion on his face. And then his eyes widened in horrified recognition. His confident posture collapsed as if his strings had been cut. The color drained from his face. "Ellie." He breathed the name, a dead sound in the sterile room. Chloe's head snapped toward her. Her perfectly made-up face contorted into a mask of disbelief and fury. "You." Eleanor ignored them both, her gaze fixed on Mark. Her voice was cold, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Mr. Stanton, your presentation was compelling. However, you failed to mention that your lead engineer quit 2 weeks ago, that your primary supplier has threatened to terminate your contract over unpaid invoices, and that your prototype failed its last 3 stress tests. You're not seeking an investment. You're seeking a bailout for a sinking ship." Every fact she stated was a perfectly aimed torpedo, blowing his flimsy presentation to pieces. The other executives stared stunned as she methodically, clinically dismantled his entire company in under 60 seconds. Mark stood frozen, speechless, exposed as a fraud in front of the very people he was trying to impress. The suave, confident CEO was gone. In his place was a terrified, humiliated man. Eleanor stood up, her composure absolute. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Stanton. We will be in touch." She walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of her ex-husband's dream. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't cried. She had simply wielded the truth like a weapon, and it had been more devastating than any emotional outburst could ever be. She hadn't been a wrecker, she had been a builder, and the first thing she had to do was clear away the shoddy foundation. Mark and Chloe stumbled out of the Pendleton Industries building in a daze. The humiliation was a physical coating on Mark's skin. He had been stripped bare professionally and personally by the woman he had dismissed as a simple homemaker. "What was that?" Chloe hissed, her voice trembling with fury as they hit the sidewalk. "How did she know all that? Have you been talking to her?" "Of course I haven't been talking to her!" Mark yelled back, his composure finally cracking. Cars honked as they argued on the busy street corner. "She's the owner, Chloe. She owns the whole damn company. She has access to everything. This is your fault." Chloe accused, her eyes wild. "You told me she was nobody. You told me you were trading up. You traded your billionaire wife for me, and I've got nothing to show for it but a maxed-out credit card and an apartment that's about to be repossessed." The raw transactional nature of their relationship was finally laid bare. "I thought your father was going to help." Mark shot back, his voice thick with desperation. "My father helps winners, Mark, not failures who get humiliated by their ex-wives." She looked at him with pure, undisguised contempt. "You're not the man I thought you were. You're weak. And I'm done." She hailed a cab, her red dress a flash of fury. "Don't call me," she spat before climbing in and slamming the door. The taxi pulled into traffic, and just like that, the vibrant, adventurous future Mark had left his wife for vanished. He was alone on a crowded street, his company in flames, his lover gone, his entire life a smoldering ruin. 2 days later, a formal offer letter from Pendleton Capital arrived at his office. Mark's hands trembled as he opened it. He was expecting a final brutal rejection. But what he read was far more cruel and far more brilliant. Pendleton Capital was offering to acquire Stanton Innovations. They weren't investing. They were buying the entire company, assets and intellectual property included. The price they offered was just enough to cover his outstanding debts and pay his creditors, leaving nothing for him or his initial investors. The offer saved the jobs of his employees and prevented him from having to declare bankruptcy, preserving his name from that final disgrace. But the real sting was in the conditions. The acquisition was contingent on him staying on for a 1-year transitional period. His new title would be Junior Project Manager. His new boss, reporting directly to the board, would be a rising star in the Pendleton Tech division. His salary was a fraction of his old one, and as the new owner of the company, all major decisions would ultimately need to be approved by Eleanor Vance. It was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. She hadn't destroyed him. She had owned him. She had taken his dream, his company, his very identity as a CEO, and turned him into her lowest-ranking employee. To refuse the deal meant certain financial ruin and a slew of lawsuits from his investors. To accept meant a year of profound daily humiliation, working as a cog in the machine of the woman he had abandoned. He was trapped. With a shaking hand he signed the papers. It was an act of complete and utter surrender. Eleanor reviewed the signed contract in her vast sunlit office overlooking the city. There was no triumph in her heart, only a quiet, resolute finality. This wasn't about Mark anymore. This was about the assets. Stanton Innovations, for all its mismanagement, had a core of good engineers and the kernel of a valuable software idea. Under Pendleton's management, it could be turned into something profitable. It was a salvage operation. She was being a builder. She buzzed her assistant. "Please schedule my 90-day review with the board for tomorrow morning," she said. "And please have the corporate counsel draft a termination agreement for Mr. Charles Sterling. His services will no longer be required." The following day, she walked into the boardroom not as a curious heiress, but as its undisputed master. She presented a detailed 90-page strategic plan for the company, outlining her vision for the next 5 years. She identified underperforming divisions to be sold, promising new markets to be explored, and innovative technologies to be acquired, starting with Stanton Innovations. Her command of the material was absolute. The board, which had once looked at her with such disdain, was now staring in awe. She concluded her presentation by announcing the formation of a new executive search committee to find a world-class CEO who would execute her vision. Charles Sterling sat ashen-faced as his reign came to an unceremonious end. He had underestimated the quiet woman, and it had cost him his career. As Eleanor left the meeting, a sea of respectful faces parting before her, she felt the last vestiges of her old life fall away. She was no longer Mark's ex-wife or Arthur's heir. She was the architect of her own future, the head of a global empire, a woman forged in betrayal and remade in fire and finance. The iron in her spine was no longer just present. It was the core of her entire being. 3 years passed. Under Eleanor's leadership, Pendleton Industries didn't just stabilize, it soared. She proved to have an almost preternatural instinct for business, a blend of Arthur's visionary boldness and her own meticulous, compassionate pragmatism. She invested heavily in sustainable technologies, streamlined the company's bloated bureaucracy, and implemented generous employee wellness programs that attracted the best talent in the world. The company's stock price tripled. The financial press, which had once called her the mystery heiress, now referred to her as the Vance Virtuoso, or the Pendleton Queen. The woman herself was transformed. The grief and uncertainty that had haunted her features were gone, replaced by a calm, unshakable confidence. She moved with purpose, spoke with authority, and commanded the respect of everyone from world leaders to the janitorial staff in her building. She had finally opened her art gallery, a non-profit space dedicated to showcasing emerging artists from underprivileged backgrounds, funded by a small fraction of her personal wealth. She had found a way to merge the woman she had been with the woman she had become. Tonight she was hosting a major philanthropic gala at the New York Public Library, announcing the formation of the Pendleton Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar charity dedicated to global education and technological literacy. Dressed in an elegant dark blue gown, she moved through the glittering crowd, a beacon of grace and power. Across the room, a man in an ill-fitting waiter's uniform was refilling champagne flutes. His shoulders were stooped, his face puffy, his eyes hollow. It was Mark Stanton. After his one-year contract of humiliation at Pendleton Industries had ended, he had been unceremoniously let go. No other tech company would touch him. His name was tainted by his spectacular failure and the widely whispered story of his downfall. He had bounced from one low-paying sales job to another, his arrogance eroded by the harsh reality of his new station. He now worked for a high-end catering company, serving drinks to the very people he had once considered his peers. He saw her from across the vast vaulted room. She was luminous, surrounded by senators, artists, and titans of industry. She was laughing, and the sound was rich and genuine. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years. An agonizing wave of regret so powerful it was nauseating washed over him. He saw not just the money he had lost, but the woman, the partner, the builder, the extraordinary person he had been too blind and too stupid to appreciate. On a desperate, foolish impulse, he set down his tray and began to make his way through the crowd toward her. He had to speak to her, to apologize, to explain. He didn't know what he wanted, forgiveness perhaps, or just to see if a flicker of the old Ellie still existed behind those powerful, confident eyes. He finally reached the edge of her circle just as a reporter was asking her a question. "Ms. Vance, you've achieved so much in such a short time. What would you say is the secret to your success?" Eleanor smiled a thoughtful, private sort of smile. "A few years ago, someone I respected very much told me I was a builder. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I've come to realize that we all have a choice. We can spend our lives demolishing things, relationships, opportunities, other people. Or we can choose to build. Building is harder. It takes patience and vision. But in the end, it's the only thing that truly lasts." Her eyes swept the crowd as she spoke, and for a fleeting second they met Mark's. There was no anger in her gaze, no hatred, no triumph. There was nothing at all. It was the indifferent glance one might give a stranger, a piece of furniture, a ghost. In that single empty moment, Mark understood the final devastating truth: she hadn't forgotten him. She had simply erased him. He no longer mattered enough to be hated. Her security chief, Robert, the same man who had once guarded her small apartment, stepped subtly between them, his presence an impassable wall. Mark faltered, then retreated, melting back into the shadows of the service staff. Later that night, back in the quiet solitude of her great-uncle's library, Eleanor opened a small locked drawer in his desk. Inside was the final letter from Arthur, with instructions that it only be opened when she felt she no longer needed his advice. "My dearest Eleanor," it read, "if you are reading this, it means you have become the woman I always knew you were. I have a final confession to make. The reason I chose you was not because of your sense of fairness or because you were a builder. Those things were true, but they were secondary. The real reason is this. 40 years ago, I was in love. A brilliant, wonderful woman. I was building my company and I was obsessed. I was arrogant. I believed she was holding me back from my destiny. I left her. It was the single greatest regret of a long and profitable life. I spent the next 4 decades building an empire, but I was alone in my castle. When I saw your husband make the same foolish, arrogant mistake that I did, I saw a chance. Not to correct my own past, but to give you the future that the woman I loved never had. I was not giving you a gift, Eleanor. I was righting a cosmic wrong 1 generation removed. The empire was never the point. It was just the tool. The point was you. The point was to give a good woman, a builder, the chance to build a world of her own. Live well in it. Yours." Arthur, tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, not of sadness, but of a profound, quiet gratitude. She looked out the window at the moonlit sound, at the vast, peaceful kingdom she now commanded. It was not a castle built on revenge or bitterness. It was an empire built on a second chance, a legacy of a long-lost love, and the quiet strength of a woman who had lost everything only to find herself. She was home. Eleanor's story is a powerful reminder that our worth is never defined by who leaves us, but by what we choose to build in their absence. She was discarded, underestimated, and left with nothing, but she transformed her pain into power. She didn't just inherit an empire, she earned the right to lead it by rediscovering the strength that was in her all along. Her journey teaches us that the end of one chapter is often the unexpected beginning of a much greater one, and that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building a life so magnificent that the past becomes an insignificant shadow. If this story of resilience and empowerment moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories. What did you think of Eleanor's final choice? Let us know in the comments below. What happens when the person who promised to love you forever becomes the one who tells you you're worthless? This is the story of Elara Vance, a woman whose brilliant mind was locked away by the man she married. Her ex-husband, a titan of Wall Street named Richard Sterling, stood in a sterile courtroom and told her, "Without my name, without my money, you will crawl back here in a year begging for scraps." He laughed as he said it. He thought he had broken her. He thought he had erased her. What he didn't know was that while he was busy slamming doors in her face, she was quietly building a key to a door he could never even imagine. He gave her 1 year to fail. She only needed 1 day to change the world. The air in the conference room of Sterling Roth and Associates was so cold it felt like it was actively stealing the warmth from Elara Vance's skin. It was a manufactured chill, the kind that costs thousands of dollars a month in electricity to maintain, designed to communicate power, efficiency, and a complete lack of sentimentality. It was the perfect setting for the end of her marriage. Across the polished mahogany table, Richard Sterling didn't look at her. He was scrolling through his phone, a dismissive flick of his thumb across the glass screen, the only sign of life. His lawyer, a man with a face like a clenched fist named Arthur Roth, slid a final document across the table. "Just this last page, Mrs. Vance." Arthur said, his voice smooth and condescending. He still called her Mrs. Vance, a final petty twist of the knife. In a few minutes that name would no longer belong to her. Elara's own lawyer, Laura Simmons, a bulldog of a woman who had been her best friend since college, placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You don't have to look at him, Elara. Just sign." But she did look. She looked at Richard, the man she had spent 12 years with, the man she had loved with a fierce, all-consuming passion. The man who had taken her ideas, her ambition, her very sense of self, and molded them into a portfolio of successes he now claimed entirely as his own. He was handsome, impeccably dressed in a custom Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than her first car. To the world, he was Richard Sterling, the venture capital wonderkind, the man with the Midas touch. To her, he was a thief. She remembered their early days huddled in a tiny Palo Alto apartment, dreaming up algorithms on a whiteboard. She was the architect, he was the salesman. Her concepts for predictive market analysis became the foundation of his first multi-million-dollar fund. Her research into neural networks, which she'd abandoned to support his career and raise their 2 children, was the ghost in his machine, the uncredited source of his genius. "Are we done here?" Richard finally spoke, his voice bored as if he were waiting for a barista to finish his latte. He pocketed his phone and looked at her, his blue eyes as cold and empty as the room. "Just waiting on your ex-wife." Arthur smirked. Elara's hand trembled as she picked up the pen. The settlement was a joke. He had tied up all their significant assets in complex corporate structures, leaving her with the heavily mortgaged suburban house he no longer wanted, and a generous alimony that was, in his words, enough to keep you comfortable while you find some little hobby to occupy your time. He was keeping the Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons beach house, the art collection, and the company she had helped build from the ground up. She pushed the signed paper back across the table. It was done. Laura began packing her briefcase. "We'll be going now." Richard stood up, straightening his tie. He walked around the table not to leave but to stand directly in front of Ilara, forcing her to look up at him. "You know," he began, his voice low and laced with a cruel sort of pity, "I almost feel sorry for you, Ilara." Laura stepped forward. "That's enough, Richard." He ignored her, his eyes locked on Ilara. "You're getting this house, this money. You should be grateful. You have no idea what the real world is like. You haven't worked a real job in over a decade. Who is going to hire you? What are you even qualified to do?" The words were designed to hurt each one, a precision-guided missile aimed at her deepest insecurities. He was reminding her that she had given up her PhD candidacy at Stanford for him, that she had turned down a promising research position at Google to be a supportive wife. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "Fine, don't fool yourself. All those little projects you tinkered with in your study? They're nothing. Child's play. You have no ambition, no killer instinct. That's why we worked so well together. I had it, and you were happy to just follow." He leaned in closer, his expensive cologne filling her senses, a scent she now associated with lies and betrayal. "Let me make a prediction," he whispered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "You'll burn through that alimony in 6 months trying to launch some ridiculous half-baked idea. When it fails, and it will fail, you'll see. You'll understand that you're nothing without me. You'll never make it, Ilara. And when you're broke and alone, you'll crawl back begging for scraps. I give you 1 year. 1 year until you're at my door." He looked at her, searching for the tears for the breakdown he so clearly craved. But he didn't find it. He found something else. In the depths of Ilara's tired, heartbroken eyes, a tiny cold star of anger began to ignite. It was an anger she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years, buried under layers of compromise and accommodation. She stood up, her spine straightening. She was shorter than him, but for the first time in a long time she didn't feel small. "Your prediction is noted, Richard," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a future to build." She turned and walked out of the room, Laura right behind her. She didn't look back. She didn't see the flicker of surprise on Richard's face, the momentary confusion of a puppeteer who has just realized one of his strings has been cut. As the heavy office door clicked shut behind her, Ilara Vance took her first breath of truly free air. It was cold, yes, but it was hers. And it was enough to fuel a fire. The heavily mortgaged suburban house felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life that was no longer hers. Every photograph on the wall was a lie, a captured moment of manufactured happiness. Within a week, Ilara had packed them all away. She sold the designer furniture, the expensive art Richard had bought to impress his clients, and the luxury SUV. She paid off a chunk of the mortgage and traded the rest for a used Subaru and a war chest. Her new life was lived in 2 rooms, the kitchen and her study. The living room was a ghost town. The master bedroom, a place she couldn't bear to sleep in, was sealed off. She moved into the guest room, a small, impersonal space that felt honest in its emptiness. Her days were a blur of caffeine and code. Richard was right about one thing: she hadn't worked a real job in years. But while he was closing deals and networking at cocktail parties, she had been learning. She'd devoured online courses in machine learning, devoured white papers on AI ethics, and taught herself 3 new programming languages. The ridiculous, half-baked idea he had mocked was a project she called Athena. It was an AI-driven adaptive learning platform for children. It wasn't just another educational app. Athena was designed to be a true digital tutor capable of understanding a child's unique learning style, be it visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. It could detect frustration or boredom through patterns in interaction and adjust its methodology in real time. It was designed to help kids who fell through the cracks of the traditional education system, kids like her own son Leo who struggled with dyslexia. The initial framework for Athena had been her passion project for years. Richard had called it her little hobby, something to keep her busy. He'd occasionally glance at her complex diagrams and say things like, "That's cute, honey? Are you making a video game?" Now her hobby was her lifeline. She called the one person she knew she could trust Ben Carter, Ben was a brilliant, perpetually scruffy programmer she'd known since her Stanford days. He had a wizard-like talent for turning theoretical code into functional, elegant software. While Ilara was the architect, Ben was the master builder. He'd taken a job at a mid-level tech firm for the stability, but his heart was in innovation. She met him at a dingy coffee shop in Mountain View, the kind of place that ran on passion and cheap espresso. She laid it all out, the divorce, Richard's parting words, and her plan for Athena. She slid a folder across the sticky table. It contained the core architecture market analysis and a shoestring budget derived from selling her old life. Ben read through it, his expression growing more and more intense. He looked up, his eyes wide. "Ilara, this is revolutionary," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "The dynamic learning algorithm, the emotional feedback recognition, it's years ahead of anything on the market. This isn't just an app, it's a paradigm shift." "But it's just an idea," Ilara said, the doubt Richard had planted still taking root. "I have no funding, no company, no connections. Richard made sure of that. He blacklisted me. I've sent out feelers to a few VCs I know. The second they hear my name, the doors close. They're all his friends." Ben leaned forward, pushing the folder back toward her. "Then we don't use his doors. We build our own." He tapped the folder. "I know some people. Angel investors, not the big sharks. People who are more interested in the tech than in the name on the letterhead. But to get in front of them, we need a working prototype, something they can see, touch, and feel." "I have the alimony," she said. "It's not much, but it can keep us afloat for a few months." Ben shook his head. "No. You use that to live. I'll handle the prototype." He took a deep breath. "I'm quitting my job, Ilara. I'll cash out my 401k. It's not a fortune, but it's enough for servers, software licenses, and enough pizza to keep us going for 6 months. I believe in this. I believe in you." Tears pricked Ilara's eyes, the first genuine, non-sorrowful tears she'd shed in months. Richard had told her she was alone, but she wasn't. The next 6 months were a brutal, exhilarating grind. Her quiet suburban house became the unlikely headquarters of their nascent startup, which they called Praxis AI. The dining room was filled with servers, their fans a constant hum. The kitchen table was their boardroom. They worked 18-hour days, fueled by Ben's endless supply of terrible coffee and Ilara's unwavering vision. They coded, they debugged, they argued, and they created. Slowly, Athena began to take shape. It was beautiful. Ilara tested the alpha version with her son Leo. She watched her heart in her throat as the program detected his frustration with a block of text and seamlessly switched to an interactive auditory exercise. Leo, who usually threw his books in anger, was engaged. He was smiling. He was learning. It was in that moment that Ilara knew she had something real. This wasn't a hobby, it was a mission. They secured a few small checks from Ben's angel investor contacts, enough to keep the lights on and hire a junior developer. But it wasn't enough to scale. They were running out of time and money. The rejection letters from the bigger VC firms piled up. Most were polite but firm. A few were more direct. One from a partner at a firm that did regular business with Richard simply said, "We do not see a viable path to market for this product." Ilara knew Richard's fingerprints were all over that one. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, with their bank account dwindling and morale at an all-time low, an email landed in Ilara's inbox. It was an automated reply, a confirmation that her unsolicited proposal had been received by Ethelred Corporation. Ethelred was the white whale of the tech world, a behemoth run by the enigmatic and legendary CEO Isabella Hayes. They were known for two things: acquiring disruptive technologies and never ever accepting unsolicited proposals. Ben looked over her shoulder. "Ethelred? You sent the proposal to Ethelred. That's like putting a message in a bottle and throwing it into the Pacific." "I know," Ilara sighed. "It was a Hail Mary." They forgot about it. 2 weeks later, another email arrived. It wasn't automated. The subject line was simple: Regarding your Athena proposal. It was from the office of Isabella Hayes. They wanted a meeting. The email from Ethelred Corp felt like a glitch in the matrix, a statistical impossibility. Alara had to read it 3 times before the words sank in. It wasn't just a meeting with some mid-level acquisitions manager. The invitation was for a formal presentation to the entire senior executive board, including Isabella Hayes herself. "This is it," Ben said, pacing the length of their makeshift server room. "This is the Super Bowl, the World Series, and the Nobel Prize ceremony all rolled into one. Ethelred doesn't do maybe. They either buy you for $1 billion or they crush you and build their own version." The pressure was immense. They had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to polish their prototype, refine their business plan, and prepare Alara to stand in a room full of sharks and convince them she was a leviathan. Laura Simmons, her lawyer and friend, came over that night with 2 bottles of expensive wine and a mountain of Chinese takeout. She transformed from friend to legal counsel, drilling Alara on corporate governance, intellectual property rights, and potential deal structures. "Don't let them see you as a small fry," Laura advised, pointing at Alara with a chopstick. "You're not a desperate startup founder. You are the chief architect of a revolutionary technology. You are offering them an opportunity, not the other way around. Project strength, even if your knees are shaking." The next 14 days were a crucible. Alara and Ben barely slept. They rehearsed the presentation endlessly. Ben streamlined the demo, making it flawless and visually stunning. Alara memorized every financial projection, every market penetration statistic, every possible answer to every conceivable question. She researched every member of Ethelred's board, learning their backgrounds, their past investments, and their pet projects. She paid special attention to Isabella Hayes. Hayes was an icon, a self-made woman who had shattered glass ceilings in the cutthroat world of enterprise technology. She was known for her razor-sharp intellect, her brutal efficiency, and her uncanny ability to see 10 years into the future. She was also intensely private. Reading about her, Alara felt a strange sense of kinship, a respect for a woman who had clearly fought her way to the top. The day before the presentation, Alara was practicing her opening remarks in front of a mirror when her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Her blood ran cold. She knew who it was. "Heard you got a meeting." "Cute. Don't embarrass yourself." It was Richard. He had his spies everywhere. The VCs, he controlled the lawyers, the bankers. His network was a web of gossip and influence. Of course he would have heard. Alara's hands started to shake. For a moment she was back in that cold conference room, him standing over her, his voice dripping with condescension. "You'll never make it, Alara." Ben found her staring at the phone, her face pale. "What is it?" She showed him the text. "That son of a bitch," Ben seethed. "He can't stand seeing you succeed. He has to try and poison it." Another text came through. "They're going to eat you alive. Isabella Hayes chews up naive idealists like you for breakfast. You don't belong in that room." "Don't listen to him," Ben said, his voice firm. "He's trying to get in your head. It's what he does. He's a parasite, and he's just realized his host is about to leave the planet." Alara took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. Ben was right. This was a tactic, a deliberate psychological attack designed to make her falter at the most critical moment. She blocked the number and threw the phone onto the couch. "He's not going to win. He's not getting in my head." But the seed of doubt had been planted. What if Richard was right? What if she was just a naive idealist? She was a coder, a thinker, an inventor. She wasn't a ruthless CEO. She was about to walk into the Colosseum armed with a good idea while everyone else had a sword and shield. That night she couldn't sleep. The numbers and statistics she had memorized swam in her head, jumbled with Richard's cruel words. She found herself drifting back to the day he'd left, the finality of his laughter echoing in the sterile office. He had been so sure of her failure. His certainty was a heavy cloak threatening to smother the fire of her own conviction. Was he just a vindictive ex-husband? Or did he see a fundamental truth about her that she refused to accept? The question haunted her through the long, dark hours before the most important day of her life. The Ethelred Corporation headquarters was a monument of glass and steel piercing the San Francisco skyline. It was designed to intimidate, to make visitors feel small and insignificant before they even reached the reception desk. Alara, dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue suit Laura had insisted she buy, walked through the cavernous lobby, her heels clicking on the polished marble floor. Ben was beside her, carrying the encrypted laptop that held Athena's soul. They were escorted to the 50th floor to a waiting area with panoramic views of the bay. The silence was absolute, the air still and cool. Every detail, from the minimalist art on the walls to the ergonomic Scandinavian furniture, screamed money and power. A severe-looking woman with a tablet led them into the boardroom. It was even more intimidating than the lobby. A long, dark wood table was surrounded by 20 chairs. At the head of the table sat Isabella Hayes. She was smaller in person than Alara had imagined, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She didn't smile. She simply nodded, a gesture that was neither welcoming nor hostile. It was neutral, analytical. The rest of the board was composed of stone-faced men and women who looked like they had been carved from granite. "Ms. Vance," Isabella Hayes said, her voice crisp and clear, "you have 60 minutes. The floor is yours." Alara walked to the front of the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a deep breath, pictured her son Leo's smiling face as he used Athena, and began. She didn't start with financials or market share. She started with a story. She spoke about the millions of kids left behind by a one-size-fits-all education system. She spoke of the frustration of parents who watched their bright children struggle. She spoke with a passion that was authentic and palpable. The board members who had been glancing at their tablets started to look up. They started to listen. Then Ben launched the demo. He projected Athena onto a massive screen. The interface was clean, intuitive, and beautiful. He ran a simulation showing how the AI adapted in real time to a user's inputs, shifting its teaching style, identifying a potential learning disability, and offering a new customized pathway to understanding. There were murmurs around the table. One of the board members, a man with a reputation for being a ruthless numbers guy, leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. Alara then moved to the business plan, her voice confident and steady. She laid out their 5-year growth strategy, their monetization model, and their projected user acquisition costs. She knew her numbers inside and out. She had built this from nothing, and her command of the details was absolute. As she was wrapping up, a side door to the boardroom opened. An assistant leaned in and whispered something to Isabella Hayes. Hayes's expression remained unchanged, but she gave a curt nod. The door opened wider and a man walked in. Alara's blood turned to ice. It was Richard Sterling. He was dressed in one of his signature expensive suits, a charming apologetic smile plastered on his face. "Isabella, my apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice oozing false sincerity. "My meeting on the 48th floor ran late. I just wanted to come by and offer some context." A cold dread washed over Alara. This wasn't a coincidence. A meeting on the 48th floor. He had engineered this. This was his masterstroke, his final public attempt to destroy her. Isabella Hayes looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Richard, we weren't aware you had an interest in this presentation." "Oh, absolutely," he said, walking casually toward the front of the room, positioning himself near Alara like a predator circling its prey. "Alara and I have a long history. I'm her ex-husband. I funded much of her early, shall we say, tinkering with this project." He was lying, painting himself as her benevolent benefactor. "I think she's done a wonderful job with her little hobby," he continued, addressing the board. "It's very sweet. But as a serious investment, I feel it's my duty as someone who cares for Alara's well-being to raise a few red flags." Ben stood up. "What are you doing, Richard?" Richard ignored him. The core concept, while idealistic, lacks a scalable commercial application. The technology is derivative of existing platforms and, frankly, the leadership He glanced at Alara with feigned sympathy. Lacks the necessary experience to navigate the competitive edtech landscape. I'm afraid this is more of a passion project than a viable enterprise. He was using his reputation, his perceived expertise, to poison the well. He was framing her as an inexperienced emotional amateur. It was the exact narrative he had whispered to her on the day of their divorce. The room was silent. The board members looked from Richard to Alara, their faces a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Richard had successfully sown chaos and doubt. He had hijacked her moment of triumph and turned it into a public humiliation. Isabella Hayes finally spoke, her voice dangerously quiet. "Mr. Sterling, you are not on the agenda. Your context is unsolicited." She then turned her piercing gaze to Alara. The entire deal, Alara's entire future, hung on her next words. "Ms. Vance," Hayes said, her eyes boring into her, "you have heard Mr. Sterling's assessment. Please respond." This was the test. All the preparation, all the late nights, all the coding and strategizing, it had all come down to this moment. Her abuser was standing right next to her in front of the most powerful people in her industry, telling them she was a failure. She could crumble or she could fight. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to slow down. The air in the boardroom grew thick and heavy. Alara could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on her, feel Richard's smug, triumphant presence beside her. His attack had been perfectly executed. He hadn't screamed or yelled. He had used the calm, rational language of a concerned investor, a tone designed to be credible to the people in this room. He had painted her as a flighty hobbyist and himself as the voice of reason. The anger she had felt on the day of the divorce, that cold, hard star of fury, reignited in her chest, burning away the fear. She looked not at Richard but directly at Isabella Hayes. "Thank you, Hayes," Alara said, her voice surprisingly calm and clear. She turned her body slightly, a subtle but deliberate act of putting Richard at her back, out of her line of sight. "And thank you, Richard, for your assessment. It's a narrative I'm quite familiar with." She addressed the board. "Mr. Sterling is correct about one thing. We do have a long history. A history in which my tinkering, as he calls it, formed the foundational algorithms for his first and most successful venture capital fund, Sterling Analytics. The predictive models that made his reputation. They were born on my whiteboard in my study from my research." A ripple of surprise went through the room. Richard's face tightened, the charming smile faltering for a second. "He calls my leadership inexperienced," Alara continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "And it's true, I haven't spent the last decade in boardrooms. I've spent it in the trenches. I've been coding, researching, and building this technology from the ground up, line by line. I was raising 2 children while teaching myself the very machine learning principles that power Athena. I would argue that managing a household, a child with learning disabilities, and the development of a sophisticated AI platform requires a level of executive function that few CEOs possess." She took a step toward the center of the room, claiming the space. "And he calls my technology derivative. Mr. Sterling wouldn't know derivative code if it bought him a new sports car. Which I might add my work has done several times over. He is a salesman. A very, very good one. But he does not understand the technology. He never has." She gestured to the screen where Athena's elegant interface still glowed. "What you see here isn't just an app. It's a dynamic neuro-linguistic programming model that integrates emotional feedback. There is nothing else like it on the market. Ask Mr. Sterling to explain the back-end architecture. Ask him to detail the ethical subroutines I designed to protect student data. He can't, because he doesn't know." She finally turned to look at Richard. His face was pale, his composure cracking. He looked flustered, exposed. "You say this is a passion project," Alara said, her voice dropping, becoming intensely personal, yet loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're damn right it is. It's born from the passion of watching my own son struggle. It's born from the passion of wanting to build something that helps people instead of just making rich men richer. But don't you dare mistake passion for a lack of commercial viability. The global edtech market is projected to be worth over $400 billion by 2026. A platform that can demonstrably improve learning outcomes for even a fraction of those students isn't a hobby. It's a unicorn. She turned back to Isabella Hayes. Mr. Sterling is afraid. He's not afraid for me. He's not afraid for Ethelred's investment. He's afraid of me. He told me on the day our divorce was finalized that I would never make it without him, that I was nothing. His presence here today is not due diligence. It's a desperate, pathetic attempt to make his prediction come true. She stood there, her chest rising and falling, her statement hanging in the silent room. She had laid everything bare, the ugly history, the personal attacks, the professional condescension. She had taken his narrative and shattered it. Richard sputtered, "This is absurd. She's being emotional. This is a personal dispute. It has no place." "I agree," Isabella Hayes said, cutting him off. Her voice was like chipping ice. She stood up. "This has no place here." She looked at Richard, and for the first time her face showed a flicker of something other than neutrality. It was contempt. "Mr. Sterling, your reputation precedes you, both as a venture capitalist and more recently in other matters that have come to my attention. We have a strict policy against outside interference in our acquisition assessments. Your context has been noted and dismissed." She turned to her assistant. "Please show Mr. Sterling out. His business here and in this building is concluded." The color drained completely from Richard's face. To be so publicly, so coldly dismissed by Isabella Hayes was a death sentence in Silicon Valley. He opened his mouth to protest, but 2 security guards had materialized silently at the door. He was escorted out of the room, his face a mask of pure, impotent fury. The room was silent again. Alara stood there, shaking slightly from the adrenaline. She had faced her dragon and won. But she still didn't know if she had won the war. Isabella Hayes walked to the front of the room and stood before Alara. She examined her for a long moment, her gaze intense and searching. "Ms. Vance," she said finally, "that was quite a display. You have more of a killer instinct than your ex-husband gives you credit for." She glanced at the screen. "Now let's talk about valuation. My team has some concerns about your initial numbers. We think you're aiming too low." The rest of the meeting was a blur. Alara, running on pure adrenaline, answered a barrage of highly technical questions from the board. They picked at her code, questioned her security protocols, and stress-tested her financial models. With Ben at her side providing the granular detail, they met every challenge. The atmosphere had shifted. The board members were no longer skeptical observers. They were engaged, intrigued, and in some cases, visibly excited. When they left the Ethelred building, the afternoon sun felt impossibly bright. Alara and Ben didn't speak as they walked to their car. They were both in a state of shock, suspended between the terror of the confrontation and the dizzying hope of what Isabella Hayes had implied. "Aiming too low," Ben finally said as they sat in the parked car, the engine off. "Did she really say we were aiming too low?" "I think so," Alara whispered, still trying to process it. Either that, or it was the most elaborate and cruel rejection in history. The drive back to her house was agonizingly quiet. They had done all they could. The decision was now out of their hands. They were told they would hear something within 24 hours. It felt like a lifetime. Alara spent the evening pacing her living room, unable to eat or sit still. Laura came over, and the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, jumping every time a phone buzzed. Laura was ecstatic when she heard about how Alara had handled Richard. "You took back your power, Alara," she said, beaming. "No matter what happens with this deal, you won. You showed him, and more importantly, you showed yourself who you really are." Despite the praise, the doubt lingered. The corporate world was fickle. Maybe Richard's stunt, though it backfired in the room, would give the board pause. Maybe they'd see her as someone who came with drama. The next morning, Alara was awake before dawn, staring at her laptop, an untouched cup of coffee beside her. At 9:15 a.m., her phone rang. The caller ID read Ethelred Corp. Her breath caught in her throat. Ben and Laura, who had stayed the night on the couches, rushed to her side. She put the phone on speaker. her hand trembling so much she could barely press the button. "This is Alara Vance." "Ms. Vance, this is Isabella Hayes." The voice was as crisp and direct as ever. "I won't waste your time. The board convened this morning. We were unanimously impressed by your technology and by your fortitude. We are formally extending an offer to acquire Praxis AI." Alara's knees felt weak. She sank into her chair. "The offer," Hayes continued, "is for a controlling interest in the company with you and your team remaining in place to run the Athena division under the Ethelred umbrella. The total valuation of the deal is $1 billion. Silence. Ben's jaw dropped. Laura covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with disbelief. Alara couldn't speak. $1 billion. The number was so vast, so astronomical, it didn't feel real. "Ms. Vance, are you there?" "Yes." Alara managed to squeak out, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'm here." "Good," said Ms. Hayes. "There is one more thing. Your ex-husband. I did not dismiss him yesterday, simply to defend your honor, though I did find his behavior reprehensible. For the past 6 months, Ethelred's corporate security has been assisting a federal investigation into securities fraud. The primary target is a group of VCs engaged in a pump-and-dump scheme involving tech IPOs. The lead target of that investigation is Richard Sterling." The room spun. "His attempt to sabotage your presentation was an act of desperation," Hayes explained. "He likely assumed if you secured a major deal, your newfound credibility might bring scrutiny to his own business practices, especially regarding the origins of his foundational technology. He was trying to silence you permanently. His little stunt yesterday just confirmed our profile of him." As Hayes was speaking, Ben's laptop, which was open to a financial news site, began flashing with a breaking news alert. "Breaking SEC raids. Sterling Analytics offices in Manhattan. Founder Richard Sterling taken into custody." The headline was stark, brutal, and final. There was a picture of Richard, his perfect suit, rumpled, his face ashen, being led out of his gleaming office building in handcuffs. The Midas touch had worn off. The Titan had fallen. It all clicked into place. Richard's increasing paranoia, his desperate need to see her fail, it wasn't just about his ego. It was about survival. Her success was a direct threat to his house of cards. Alara hung up the phone. The tears of joy mingled with tears of shock. The man who had told her she would be nothing in a year had lost everything in a single day. His prediction had come true, but in a way he could never have fathomed. It was not her who was broke and alone. It was him. The contract would be signed the next day. The very day her year of failure was supposed to begin. The signing ceremony was not held in a cold, sterile conference room. At Alara's request, it took place at a local school in a low-income district, one that had agreed to be a pilot for the Athena platform. The press was there, but the real audience was a room full of children, teachers, and parents. Alara stood at the podium not in a power suit, but in a simple, elegant dress. She looked out at the faces of the children and saw the future. When she signed the contract opposite Isabella Hayes, the flashbulbs of the cameras were a distant pop. The real light for her was the look of hope in the eyes of a young girl in the front row who, like her own son, struggled to read. After the official ceremony, Isabella Hayes stood with Alara by a window overlooking the schoolyard. "I never told you why I was so interested in Athena," Hayes said quietly, her formal demeanor softening for the first time. "I grew up like these kids. Poor. Overlooked. I had a severe processing disorder that went undiagnosed. Teachers called me slow. It wasn't until a single librarian took an interest in me, found a way to teach me visually, that I unlocked my potential." She looked at Alara. "You didn't just build a piece of software, Ms. Vance. You built 1,000 librarians. You built a tool that tells every child they're worth the effort. That's not something you can put a price on, but $1 billion is a good start." As Alara was leaving, a familiar figure was waiting for her on the sidewalk past the security line. It was Richard. He was out on bail, looking like a ghost of his former self. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were hollow, and the arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a desperate, haunted look. "Elara," he said, his voice raspy. I saw the news. Congratulations." She stopped looking at him, not with hatred, but with a profound and weary pity. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a small, broken man. "I need your help," he pleaded. "They're going to take everything. You could talk to them, tell them about the early days, that the ideas were yours. Maybe they'd be lenient if—" "No, Richard," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I can't help you." "But why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "After everything—" "Because of everything," she replied. "My story isn't about you anymore, Richard. It's not about revenge, and it's not about the past. It's about them." She nodded toward the school. "My work is just beginning, and you have to face the consequences of your own choices. Goodbye." She walked away without looking back, getting into the modest Subaru that now felt more valuable to her than any luxury car. She wasn't Mrs. Vance, the socialite wife. She wasn't Elara, the scorned ex. She was Elara Vance, founder of Praxis AI, creator of Athena, and the architect of her own destiny. Richard had given her 1 year to fail. She had taken 1 day to build a legacy. And as she drove toward the horizon, she knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning. 6 months had passed since the day the world turned on its axis. The makeshift headquarters in Elara's suburban house was now a quiet, lived-in home again. The hum of servers had been replaced by the sound of her children's laughter. The new headquarters for the Athena division of Ethelred was a testament to the magnitude of her new reality. It occupied 3 full floors of a gleaming new tower in San Francisco, a cathedral of brushed steel, smart glass, and open-concept collaboration spaces. Elara walked through the bustling office, no longer the scrappy startup founder, but the president of a division with a 9-figure budget and over 200 employees. She knew most of them by name. She had insisted on being part of the hiring process, building a team that shared her passion, not just for technology, but for the mission behind it. Ben Carter, now her CTO, with a perpetually bewildered smile and a corner office he rarely used, was leading a team of the brightest minds in AI. Laura Simmons had been brought on as chief counsel, her bulldog tenacity now protecting Athena from corporate predators instead of a single manipulative ex-husband. On the surface, everything was perfect. The pilot programs in schools were a resounding success. Early data showed a 30% improvement in learning outcomes for students using the platform. A major tech magazine had just run a cover story on her, a glossy, flattering profile with the headline, "The Architect: How Elara Vance Built Tomorrow's Classroom." Yet a subtle disquiet hummed beneath the surface of her new life. It was an echo, the lingering resonance of the battle she had fought, reminding her that victory was not an event, but a process. The first tremor came from the very magazine article meant to celebrate her. While the piece was positive, the journalist had woven the story of her divorce throughout the narrative. They called her success the ultimate revenge, framing her motivation as a response to Richard rather than a passion for her work. It subtly diminished her agency, painting her as a woman scorned who struck it rich, rather than a brilliant innovator who was always destined for greatness. It was a narrative she couldn't control, and it stung. The second tremor came from within Ethelred itself. While Isabella Hayes was her steadfast champion, a trillion-dollar corporation was an ecosystem of competing ambitions. Julian Croft, the executive VP of the Enterprise Solutions Division, was a corporate lifer who saw Athena as a flashy, resource-draining pet project. He was a master of the backhanded compliment and the skeptical question cloaked as due diligence. In a quarterly budget meeting, he challenged her request for funding an ambitious global expansion. "The numbers from the pilot program are charming, Elara," he said, the use of her first name in the formal setting a deliberate power play. "But we're talking about an immense capital outlay for a project that serves the public sector. Its path to profitability is, shall we say, more philanthropic than strategic." Are we sure we aren't letting a compelling narrative get in the way of sound fiscal judgment? It was Richard's condescension in a $1,000 suit. He wasn't calling her work a little hobby, but the implication was the same. It was soft idealistic and not the work of a serious business person. The old anger flared, but she had learned. She didn't let it show. "Thank you for the question, Julian," she responded, her tone even and cool. "What you call a philanthropic path is actually a path to market dominance. We are building a foundational relationship with the next generation of users. The data we are ethically gathering on learning patterns is the most valuable educational data set in the world. The long-term enterprise applications from corporate training to continuing medical education are exponential. We aren't just building a product, we are building the entire ecosystem. This isn't charity. It's a long-term investment that will dwarf the revenue from your legacy enterprise clients within a decade." She won the room and she got her budget. But she walked out knowing she had a new kind of fight on her hands, a political one fought with spreadsheets and projections instead of raw passion. The deepest tremor, however, came that evening. She was helping her son Leo with his homework. He was excelling using a consumer version of Athena to help him navigate his dyslexia. He was happy, more confident than she had ever seen him. "Mom?" he asked suddenly, looking up from his tablet. "A kid at school, Jason. He said you became super rich because Dad was a bad guy and went to jail. He said you were getting revenge. Is that true?" Ilara's heart seized. The glossy magazine article, the corporate battles, they were abstract. This was real. This was the echo of her past creeping into her children's lives. She knelt down in front of him, taking his hands. "Your dad made some very bad choices in his business, and he is facing the consequences for them. That's a separate thing," she said carefully. "But Athena, I built Athena for you, Leo. I started it long ago because I saw how smart and brilliant you were, and I wanted to build a tool that could help the world see it too. My success didn't come from your dad's failure. It came from my love for you." He seemed to accept that, but the conversation left her shaken. Her victory wasn't a clean, happy ending. It was a complex, messy reality that her children would have to navigate alongside her. The final echo arrived the next day via a phone call from Laura. "I've just had a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office," Laura said, her voice all business. "They're preparing for Richard's trial. His lawyers are trying to paint him as a visionary who was betrayed by his partners. The prosecution wants to establish a pattern of unethical behavior. They want to talk to you, Ilara. They want you to testify about how he stole your intellectual property for Sterling Analytics." Ilara closed her eyes. She was being pulled back into the one place she never wanted to visit again. Testifying would mean sitting in a courtroom under oath and recounting the most painful years of her life in public detail by excruciating detail. It would give men like Julian Croft more ammunition and the media a fresh new angle for their woman-scorned narrative. It would be a distraction from her mission, from the future she was trying to build. But if she refused, Richard might get a lighter sentence. His lawyers might succeed in rewriting history, recasting him as a tragic hero. Justice would not be fully served. She stood in her vast, beautiful office, the symbol of everything she had won, and felt the walls closing in. She looked out at the city skyline, a landscape of infinite possibility that now seemed fraught with invisible tripwires. She had defeated her tyrant, but she now understood that his ghost would linger. Her greatest challenge was no longer about proving him wrong. It was about proving to herself and to the world that she could build a legacy so bright that it would finally once and for all cast out the last of his shadows. Ilara Vance's story isn't just about a billion-dollar contract. It's about the incredible power of resilience and the quiet, unshakable strength of a person who refuses to let someone else write their ending. It's a reminder that your worth is never determined by the opinions of those who try to tear you down. The world is full of Richards who will tell you that you are nothing without them, that your dreams are just little hobbies. But it's also full of Ilara's people with brilliant ideas burning inside them, just waiting for the freedom to build. Her triumph wasn't just signing a piece of paper, it was reclaiming her own narrative. So what is the lesson here? Never ever let anyone else hold the pen to your life story. If this story inspired you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of incredible triumph over adversity. Let us know in the comments below who is the Ben or Laura in your life who has always believed in you. We can't wait to hear from you.